G'day, gang. Welcome to the Hidden Why podcast, episode 1154. I'm excited to bring you this episode. It's not the first time we had this gentleman on the show. It's the second or third, I believe. I should really check that. But anyway, Donald Robertson is my guest today. He is a cognitive behavioural therapist, Stoic expert, and the author of a number of books, including How to Think Like a Roman Emperor, which is what we spoke about in our last interview. And in this interview, we talk more about his more recent book, How to Think Like Socrates, which was released in 2024. And we explore how ancient philosophy, particularly Stoicism and the teachings of Socrates, laid the foundation for modern psychotherapy. And it goes well beyond the surface level self-improvement mumbo-jumbo. There's so much depth in this conversation, and that's why we spoke for over 90 minutes. Donald breaks down the idea of eudaimonia, a richer, more meaningful version of happiness. And you know what I'm all about here at the Hidden Why podcast is to try and find a life with greater meaning, fulfillment, and happiness. And this really breaks into some deep questionings I have around happiness and what that means. And he relates it back to this idea of eudaimonia and what that means. So he unpacks it so well, he explains it so well, he uses history so well to make this conversation deep, but really significant as well, and so many practical insights to take away. And what I really think it brings to me is the idea of giving ourselves more time to go inner, to go inwards, to give more time to thought and journaling so we can better understand ourselves. Know thyself, as we talked about in this interview as well. I hope you enjoy this one, guys. This is episode 1154. Show notes can be found at thehiddenwhy.com. Reach out, speak at the other end. Donald, welcome to the Hidden Why podcast.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. It's nice to speak to you again. Very much looking forward to our conversation.
Just trying to think. This might be the third time I've had you on the show over the years.
Is it? Well, that's
definitely the second.
Luckily, I'm not running out of things to say. We've got a lot to talk about, but yeah, it's good to be back.
You keep writing, and Stoicism, philosophy. You're a clinical psychologist, right?
I'm not a clinical psychologist. No. I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist. It's pretty similar.
Similar stuff? What's the difference?
Yeah, it's pretty similar. What's the difference?
They use cognitive behavioural therapy in psychology, don't they?
Yeah, it's a different profession. To be in the UK, at least when I trained, to be a cognitive behavioural therapist, you don't have to be a psychologist, but you have to be a psychologist to be a clinical psychologist. So my background is philosophy. It's more interdisciplinary, basically. But we do similar things. We do CBT. A lot of my best friends are clinical psychologists, so we move in the same circles.
What's the overlap there? I mean, obviously your deep interest and study into philosophy with cognitive behavioural therapy. Is it about how we think?
Oh, gosh. Well, my first degree was in philosophy, and then my master's was at an interdisciplinary centre where we all studied the relationship between psychotherapy, sociology, philosophy and stuff like that. And then that kind of set the agenda for my whole career. So to answer your question, for me, there's a bunch of things. It's got to do with how you think, but also, well, let me ask you a question. Who invented psychotherapy?
Who invented psychotherapy? God knows.
I'm interviewing you now.
Yeah.
Well, some people think it's Sigmund Freud, but those people are idiots, right? Because psychotherapy already existed when Freud came along. Even in the modern world, Freud trained in psychotherapy. He went to France to train in psychotherapy. And it really originated in the early 19th century, the mid-19th century in the modern world as we know it today. The first psychotherapists were actually hypnotists and then hypnosis. Freud did hypnosis originally, then it evolved into modern psychotherapy. But psychotherapy existed in the ancient world. Dun, dun, dun. I mean, they didn't have consulting rooms, and clinical programs and stuff like that. But the concept of a therapia of the psyche existed very explicitly in the ancient world. Not everything is new. Some disciplines have been around for a really long time. And the Stoic philosophers in particular, Socrates described his philosophy as a type of medicine or therapy for the soul. And then the Stoics who came... Stoicism was founded roughly 100 years after Socrates died. All right, he was executed. We don't talk about that, but they gave him the chop in Athens. We won't hold that against him. We don't hold that against him today. But 100 years later, the Stoics came along and they liked Socrates, and they took a lot of his ideas and they took the stuff that he said that was kind of therapeutic, and they really leaned into that more than any of the other schools of philosophy. So there was a book that I'd love to get my hands on, but it doesn't exist anymore. There's a lost book called, it was part of a 4-volume text by Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoic school, one of the greatest intellectuals of the ancient world. He's up there, like in the eyes of other ancients, he was up there with Aristotle as one of the greatest thinkers of antiquity. And Chrysippus wrote hundreds of books, supposedly wrote 700 books, and one of them was a big 4-volume masterpiece called Peripathon, on the pathological emotions, on psychopathology, basically. And the 4th volume of it was called To Therapeuticon, on therapy for pathological emotions. Right. It's the first ever book on psychotherapy, right? And that was written around about 2,250 years ago. But this is before the Bible. It's before the centuries before the New Testament. Wow. Probably the first ever book on psychotherapy. So there's a historical connection. Modern psychotherapy, over time, what happened is philosophy originally was almost like a kind of catch-all, and philosophers kind of did everything. And then over time, like Aristotle in particular, wrote books on everything. And over time, other disciplines kind of got carved off from philosophy. So psychotherapy originally was kind of a branch of philosophy, and then eventually it kind of became its own separate thing. Psychology was a branch of philosophy originally. It wasn't until in the 19th century that psychology really became a separate subject from philosophy. So we think of these as different subjects today, but in the ancient world, they saw them as all part of the same thing.
Yeah. Massive history there. What drew you to Socrates and writing this book?
Well,
to actually, me, what would define Socrates? What made him different?
Well, first of all, the thing I'd say about him, it's the least interesting thing to say about him in a way, is he's the quintessential Athenian philosopher. He was from Athens, and that's unusual because most of the philosophers who came before him were not from Athens. They came from other regions of Greece. And then Athens really became the kind of centerpiece of philosophy. But Socrates is a quintessential Athenian philosopher. What makes him interesting? He's like an onion, basically. He's got these layers upon layers. It's like reading Shakespeare. There's books that you could read, or movies that you could watch, or pieces of music that you listen to, and you think that's kind of interesting, but I don't know if I'd want to keep going back to it repeatedly for the rest of my life. But then you might discover a really complex piece of classical music, or a complex, really profound piece of literature like Shakespeare or something. You think I could keep going back and exploring this and reading it like indefinitely. There's so much going on in it. Socrates is like that in philosophy. Like, he's right at the very kind of origin of things. There were philosophers that came before him, but we call those guys, do you know what we call the philosophers that came before Socrates?
No.
The pre-Socratics, right? Because he was such a big deal. There's before and after Socrates, right? So the guy, literally the guys that came before him are just called the pre-Socratics, right? And then he came along and he changed everything. What if you asked an ancient thinker, author, what the big deal was with Socrates? Funnily enough, they usually give an answer that people don't tend to mention much today. They'd say the big deal with him was he took the philosophical method, which people previously had used to talk kind of about metaphysics and about the nature of the cosmos and stuff. And they say what Socrates did was he brought it down to earth, and he applied the dialectical method, the question and answer method, as the Greeks called it, the methodology of philosophy. He applied it to everyday ethical questions, like how you should actually live your life. Other philosophers have kind of touched on that, but Socrates brought it front and center, and he made it his main concern, and he systematically applied the philosophical method to it. And when he does that, we've got a special name for it. Like, we just call it the Socratic method, right? And everybody knows about it. We can know about Socratic questioning. So when he took that method and began applying it in that particular way, he evolved it a bit. That's where we get the idea of the Socratic method from. And actually, funnily enough, the Socratic questioning is one of the main techniques that we tend to refer to today under that name in modern psychotherapy. Psychotherapists call what they do Socratic questioning, because it's, to some extent, it's kind of loosely descended from and modelled on.
What is Socratic questioning?
It's like normal questioning, only better. Like it's got a more Socratic flavour to it. So what does it look like? It's a little bit tricky to explain, because actually nowhere do. So I should back up and explain that we don't have any writings from Socrates, but we know a lot about him because he was super famous, and because Plato, one of his students, happened to be a genius and a prolific author, and wrote many dialogues, like almost like little plays, featuring Socrates talking with other people about philosophy. So what might seem odd to modern readers is that we don't have like an essay that he wrote or a book in the format that we're used to. What we get are these conversations that seem to kind of meander and go all over the place, right? So we don't have a thing where he sits down and goes, here's the 5. What you get today is we get spoon-fed everything, right? So today we'd get a blog article that says, here are the 5 steps to doing the Socratic method or something like that. We don't have that from Socrates. You know, learn the Socratic method in 3 easy steps doesn't really exist. What we get is to watch him doing it. And so we can kind of infer what the characteristics are. So basically, to give a very schematic description of it, he usually asks people to define a virtue that is integral to what they're interested in, right?
Okay.
So he brings it right down to earth. So he might be talking to he gets drawn into, in one of the dialogues in the Lackeys, he gets drawn into a kind of argument or a debate that's going on with some Athenian generals, like you do, and they're arguing about training their sons how to fight in heavy armor for some reason. And Socrates gets them onto the subject of how to define courage, right? So he does this slightly odd thing of steering conversations around to what he thinks is the kind of assumption that everybody is making, like that courage is important and that giving the sons this military training would be a way of developing their courage. And that's a good thing. And Socrates kind of immediately dives in and says, but what is courage? I mean, we could sit here and debate what the best type of course is to spend money on for your kids, but do you guys even know what courage is? Like, would you know it if you saw it? What does it look like? Right. So he really drags people's attention to their fundamental assumption. And he asks them to define it in words, which might not sound like a big deal, but that's a slightly odd thing to do. And it definitely feels odd when someone makes you do it. Right. Because we take these concepts for granted. If you say to somebody, how would you define courage? They'll often give the answer that St. Augustine gave when he was asked how to define time. He said, I know what time is. I talk about it all the time. I take it for granted. But if someone asked me to explain a definition of time, then I'm just kind of lost for words, right? Even though it seems like the most familiar thing in the world. Yeah. So we all know what courage is, or do we? But it's simply asking people to give a dictionary definition of it, as it were, is a big ask, as we say today. And so people would stumble, and typically they do a similar thing initially. They'd usually answer in a way that's most familiar to them, and often they'd kind of point at an example. And so these Athenian generals say, okay, courage is standing your ground in the face of the enemy. Well, that's the way they use the word. Because the Greeks were particularly known for fighting in the phalanx formation. And for that to work, you have to stay in formation rigidly. You have to be trained not to break formation. Because you use a shield and a spear, and your shield protects you, but because of the nature of the formation, it also protects the guy on your left. And so if you break formation, you endanger your comrades. So that's frowned upon. And the thing that made it most effective was this kind of rigid formation. So an Athenian general would think it's a really big deal, and I spend all day, every day, beating these guys around the head to get them to stand their ground in the face of the enemy and not break formation. And so that's how I would define courage, right? the most salient, obvious definition for him. It's pretty straightforward. Socrates says, "Thanks very much. That's a nice definition. I like that. I'm going to add that to my list." But then he's kind of like Columbo. Have you ever seen Columbo?
Mm.
The detective. He's just leaving, like normally, and then he'll turn around and he'll go, "Just one more thing." Like, and that's kind of how Socrates comes across a lot of the time in these dialogues. Like, so sometimes what often happens is people will read the Socratic dialogues and then they kind of get bored a couple of pages in and they give up, because often he seems like he's asking quite simple questions initially, and then it gets more and more kind of involved and kind of a bit crazier, and the really interesting stuff starts to emerge further down the line. So Socrates will say, "Well, that's a good definition, but just one more thing." And the Athenian generals, Nicias and lackeys, say, "Well, what's the problem?" And Socrates says, "What if you're in the cavalry?" And they say, "What do you mean?" And he says, "Well, the cavalry don't hold their ground in the face of the enemy. They charge into the enemy in order to break their formation." Like, this whole point of it.
Yeah.
And they say, "Okay." And he says also, "What about the Spartans?" Like, at least at that time, he said the Spartans don't fight in a rigid formation like that. They also, like a cavalry, charge headlong into the enemy in an attempt to break the enemy's formation. Like, and they say, "Okay, yeah, the Spartans are very courageous and they don't hold their ground." He says also, "What if you're fighting a tactical retreat? Like, then you can't really be said to be holding your ground, but you can still be exhibiting courage, right?" Socrates had actually fought in a famous tactical retreat. And they're like, "Yeah, that's true, that's true." And then Socrates says, "No, so you're not talking about the military, but what about civilians? Do they not exhibit courage as well?" "No, okay. Like, we see what you're doing here. Like, our definition is too narrow, right? We need to kind of broaden this definition a little bit." And so Socrates is sometimes said to expose contradictions. He's often exposing exceptions to the original definition, and he encourages people to progressively refine their definition usually of a virtue, not always, but generally of a kind of abstract concept or a virtue that they really care about. So there's several interesting things about this. One is that usually they feel confident that they know the answer. So he's kind of he does something that annoys people. Like, he often exposes their ignorance about fundamentally important concepts that they take for granted. And there's also something quite jarring about it, because normally people want to launch into a talk about how to apply a concept. So they want to talk about what courage is, right? The Greeks were great at giving these long speeches. They were known for it. And Socrates used to really annoy them by interrupting them and saying, "Back up. Like, you're giving this whole speech about what's just and unjust, but what are you assuming the definition of justice is?" Right? And arguably, we don't do that enough. It's a way of concealing errors. Like, if we just take a concept for granted and then talk about it, applying it, like, kind of, we conceal the fact. So often the shakiest part of someone's argument is the bit that they are taking for granted. And it creates a kind of smokescreen when we do that. And we say a lot of things about justice, like, without actually, I mean, how many modern politicians could define what they mean by justice? Like, how many modern politicians could define what they actually mean by, the well-being of the society that they live in? But these are things that they're supposed to be talking about, right? But
that's really questioning the why behind why we think this certain way or why we believe this certain thing.
It's the hidden why. It's the hidden why. It'll get you every time. Like, so he wants to drag that out into the open to make the unconscious conscious, as we sometimes say, and to question it. But the other feature of that, so sometimes people didn't like that. Like, it divided the audience. Some people loved that and they found it kind of addictive and liberating. And then other people got annoyed about it, particularly powerful and important people, and also older people. So older, more mature men that were very wealthy and powerful didn't like that because it threatened their status in Athenian society. And that's why Socrates was known in part. He started off talking, we kind of can see this trajectory that his career follows. He said that originally he went and spoke to one of the most senior politicians in Athens, and then he sought out one of the wisest men in Athens, sophist Protagoras. who was called the wisest man alive by his followers. But over time, Socrates increasingly talked to young men in a wider, he talked to everybody. He talked to rich people, poor people, Athenians, foreigners, slaves, and most controversially of all, perhaps, he did philosophy with women, which was shocking in the ancient world. So for a bunch of reasons, this really upset the apple cart. So Socrates was kind of, through questioning, exposing the fact that people of status, rich Athenian men, sometimes were kind of ignorant about the concepts they were employing. And at the same time, he was showing that prostitutes, slaves, foreigners were sometimes capable of giving insight and wisdom and better definitions about the virtues. And that annoyed people. And that's one of the many reasons, and there are several reasons, but it's one of the reasons that they made him drink hemlock.
Hemlock?
Yeah. They got rid of him. They gave him the chop, as we said earlier, because he mainly, in particular, because he upset some Athenian politicians.
Right. Yeah. How did he, as far as the Stoic philosophies go, how did he incorporate that into how he lived his life?
Well, I'll give you an example. Right. So we've kind of meandered, in a kind of Socratic fashion. We've had an interesting conversation about, and give you a picture of what Socrates' life was like. So I'll give you something that's a little bit more concrete. In Plato's Republic, so Plato, his most famous student, Plato's most famous book is the Republic. The Republic consists of about 10 chapters. It's really, really long. I think it's the longest of these dialogues. Some of them are relatively short. It's like 10 of them put together, basically, right? So a lot of people try and read the Republic and they don't get that far. Like, it's kind of hard going unless you're a bit of a nerd about classical philosophy, right? There are better, easier texts for an access point to Socrates. Well, funnily enough, towards the end of that book, I think it's in book 10, Socrates is having a conversation with Plato's elder brother called Glaucon. It's a dialogue. And he's going on about Greek tragedy. And Socrates thinks Greek tragedy, highest form of Greek art, sets a bad example. He says it's not really a good example for young people. And Glaucon says, what do you mean? And Socrates said, well, the characters in Greek tragedy are really often the cause of their own suffering. And Glaucon's like, what do you mean, Socrates? He's basically saying they're kind of idiots, these people, right? So they don't really provide us with very good role models. Like, they handle everything badly. And that's partly why these stories are so tragic. Like, they're making things worse for themselves in many cases. And Socrates says, yeah, that's not how a wise person would cope with adversity. Like, then none of these people behave like they have wisdom, right? So they're not very good role models. And Glaucon says, well, what are you talking about? Like, well, how would a wise person respond in the face of adversity? Something bad happened in life, in the face of misfortune.
Yeah.
And Socrates says, well, they would do 4 things. So now he is giving you, like, the clickbait, like, bullet point list. Because there was 4 things that they do. I'll try and remember what they are. He says, number 1, they would suspend judgment about whether the thing that happens is really bad or good. And actually, this is a big theme in Greek tragedy. It's obvious to the Greeks, because often somebody has real good luck in a Greek tragedy, and then it turns out it's actually a bad thing.
Right.
Like, so Oedipus in Oedipus Tyrannus, Oedipus Rex, he meets a beautiful woman and he marries her, and she turns out to be the queen, and he becomes the king. Just one thing, he then discovers that it's actually his own mother, because he was abandoned as an infant.
Right.
So he's committed incest, right? So that kind of ruins things for him a bit. Like, everything was going great until he discovered that he'd unintentionally committed incest. Like, and then he kind of goes crazy and stuff. This is a really terrible thing for Greeks. Yeah. So Socrates says you shouldn't jump the gun and prejudge things. Like, it looked like things were going really well, but then it turned out it was actually a really bad thing that you'd married this woman. And likewise, Socrates said that during his life, he fought in a war called a huge war, like to the Greeks, it was like a world war. It engulfed the whole Greek world, called the Peloponnesian War.
Yeah.
And really, it was between the two superpowers of the region, between Athens and Sparta. And in that war, the Athenians lost, and the Spartans installed a military junta in Athens. And under the junta, called the 30 Tyrants, a lot of people got rounded up and executed. Like thousands of people were executed in the Agora. And Socrates used to say to people that had complained that they were poor and that they had no status in Athenian society, he'd say, you used to complain all the time about how poor you were and how other people had much more status. But those people all got dragged into the forum and they were strangled by the 30 tyrants. And so you guys are the only ones that are left alive. So, and turns out you were lucky. Like, you dodged a bullet.
Yeah.
Right? It's like that old story about the guy whose horse runs away or whatever. You know, Socrates saying it seemed to you like it was bad luck that you were poor and lacked status, but it turned out to work in your favor in the end. Like when the Spartans took over, like you went under the radar. So he says the wise person suspends judgment about whether winning the lottery is a good thing or not, like until he sees how it pans out in the long term.
Right.
Glaucon says, well, what else does he do? And Socrates said, well, a wise person knows that if he grieves excessively about a problem, then he potentially just doubles the amount of suffering that it causes. So if something bad happens and he freaks out about it, then he's taken something that was already unpleasant or painful and he's added a whole additional layer of suffering to it. And then the third thing was that he says a wise person tells himself that nothing is all important in the grand scheme of things. So a wise person realizes that no individual event is life-defining. Like, it's not like the most important thing that it defines the whole quality of your life. You have to see it in its context as just one individual event within a bigger picture. And so then Glaucon says, well, what's the fourth thing? Socrates said there were four things. And Socrates says, well, the fourth thing is the most important thing of all. And Glaucon says, well, what's that then? And he says, the wise person tells himself that freaking out, worrying, or grieving excessively, as he puts it, in the face of misfortune, prevents him from doing the very thing that's most required.
Right.
And Glaucon says, what's that supposed to be? And Socrates says, well, that's to think rationally and to problem solve.
Right.
Like, because when we kind of freak out, like, we prevent ourselves from being able to think clearly. And actually, someone who's used to dealing with misfortune and adversities knows that the most important thing is to keep their cool and have a cool head and think clearly about the problem so that they can actually... That type of person is a natural leader. Like, because everyone else is running around going woo, woo, woo and waving their arms in the air. But the person that keeps a cool head and is able to think very clearly about things is the only one that really knows what to do in a situation like that. So Socrates says, you know, a wise person realizes that freaking out is the opposite of what's required when you're actually facing a serious an emergency or a crisis. So those are four pieces of practical advice. And all of those pieces of advice are pretty similar to the sort of things that we would do in modern cognitive therapy, right? Like those aren't crazy pieces of advice. And they're clearly self-improvement, self-help, therapeutic, coping strategies, whatever you want to call them. But most people don't realize that Socrates in the Platonic dialogues describes these type of psychological coping techniques. He does it all over the place. But they're kind of buried in these long-winded dialogues, right? But in there, we have clear descriptions of robust emotional coping techniques that are still valid today.
Bringing those into the modern world today for people out there that want to live a happier, calmer, joyful life. How do we apply those? Because they seem so simple.
Yeah.
But if they're that simple,
why aren't we doing them already?
Happier and calmer.
Well, I think Socrates has kind of got an answer to that. And it's weirdly, who's the bad guy in this story? Right? So you can't have Socrates without having a bunch of guys that surrounded him and he was very interested in, called the Sophists.
Right.
The Sophoi. right? Who were the sophists? Well, they were a weird hybrid. I used to think this was a weird hybrid of human being, a kind of chimera, like a mixture of different animals. So on the one hand, they were experts on rhetoric, verbal manipulation, and persuasion skills. They would train young men to win arguments in the law courts and deliver speeches in the political assembly.
Right.
So they taught people the art of persuasion. So they were political advisors, but they were also self-improvement gurus. People went to them because they wanted to acquire sophistication, is the word that we use today. They wanted culture and they wanted to develop wisdom and virtue.
Right.
That's why Protagoras was called the wisest man alive. He claimed to be able to teach wisdom and virtue and communication skills. And so I thought that was like a weird hybrid of things, self-improvement and political spin or rhetoric. These two things seem to me like oil and water, that they don't really combine very well together, right? And then one day I realized that we're surrounded by an age of the internet sophists, essentially. There's a kind of whole new generation of them that have appeared. History kind of repeats itself in cycles. So you have, influencers in the manosphere or, in other regions of the internet who go on and on and on and on and on and on and on about politics and who also claim to be doing self-improvement. And I thought, wow, that's exactly the weird mixture of things that the sophists used to do. These two things that it seems obvious to me combine really badly together. Because a lot of political rhetoric is about blaming other people for your problems. I don't know if you've noticed that, right? But generally, as a therapist, we really don't feel that what we're doing looks anything like political rhetoric. It's kind of the opposite. Usually we're trying to kind of like de-indoctrinate people from all the hate and prejudice and greed that they've been hyped up into by watching too many YouTube videos and reading too much online, and all the fear and anxiety and catastrophizing that they've picked up from the news. So usually in cognitive therapy, one of the things we do is to use Socratic questioning to challenge common thinking errors, like catastrophizing would be an example, right? And yet, but rhetoric does the opposite. It deliberately uses thinking errors. It cultivates thinking errors. It encourages. So a rhetorical trope is hyperbole, deliberate exaggeration, right?
Right.
But in therapy, we undo catastrophizing. That's a form of exaggeration about how awful something's going to be. We decatastrophize, right? So we're literally doing the opposite. It's counter rhetoric. So the idea that you could do self-improvement and political rhetoric, that's why it's like oil and water to me, because political rhetoric generally stokes people's emotions up. It tries to evoke fear. It tries to evoke anger. It tries to play on people's greed. And in therapy, we're kind of doing the opposite. Socrates emerged as a reaction to the sophists. People looked around and they thought, we need someone to help us deal with this propaganda and brainwashing and manipulation of the youth. And Socrates was in the middle of it. And all he did, he was in the unusual position of he refused to present himself as a guru or a teacher. Instead, he assumes the role more of a student or a questioner. Right? He doesn't give lectures, he just asks questions. So he's like, imagine you go to a lecture and there's a famous guy speaking and he says, has anyone got any questions in the audience? And there's a guy in the audience whose questions are more interesting than the speech that the guy on the stage is giving. Well, that's what Socrates was like. So half of the audience thought, this guy's really, I'm more interested in this guy's questions. And the other half of the audience thought, shut up, you're annoying, right? We should get you to drink hemlock, right? And execute you. So, that's the kind of position that he occupied. Now,
so it's really a case for a deeper awareness through that questioning.
It's a type of awareness. Socrates said that wisdom, so you've heard before philosophy, there's a temple in a place called Delphi, the Temple of Apollo, and it was famous for maxims. It had 3 famous maxims at the entrance to the temple, but the cult of Apollo at Delphi was famous for publishing a list of like hundreds of maxims, and most of them are like Zen koans. Like most of them are specifically 2 words in Greek. Interestingly, Plutarch, the philosopher, said they're like seeds, from which philosophy grows. So he said, although these maxims are often 2 words, books many volumes long have been written about them. Now, one of the maxims, the most famous maxim of Delphi, says "Gnothisiauton," which means "know thyself."
Right.
And that became almost like a theme that resonates through the whole of Greek philosophy, in a sense, kind of grows from the seed of these 2 words.
Yeah.
Like the other one, the second most famous one, is "Maiden agan," which means nothing in excess, all things in moderation, which is essential to this day, a kind of principle of Greek ethics and well-being, right? That kind of runs through all Greek ethical philosophy. And the other one, actually, funnily enough, is difficult to translate into English, but it means something like being overly certain about things leads to catastrophe. And you can see Socrates believed that the fundamental thing he was doing was exposing something he called double ignorance, right? So most people think that ignorance is a bad thing, but Socrates said those people are idiots. They're wrong, right? He said there's nothing wrong with ignorance. Like, it's relatively harmless. He said, I'm ignorant about many things. Got no idea how to cure diseases or build ships and stuff like that. And generally speaking, it doesn't cause me too many problems in life. He said the real problem is something more specific that Socrates and Plato called double ignorance. And double ignorance, it's kind of a bit like the Dunning-Kruger phenomenon. Double ignorance is when you're ignorant of your ignorance, right? So
deliberately ignorant.
Well, not deliberately, almost the opposite, unintentionally. You don't know that you're ignorant. You don't realize how ignorant you are. Like when you think you know a thing or two, but actually you don't. And so Socrates said, well, suppose you're a politician and you believe that you understand how medicine works, but you've never really studied it. So you overestimate your grasp of the subject. He said that could be extremely dangerous. You could give bad advice to people, like particularly if you're in the assembly. Like you could do a lot of harm if you convinced other people as well that you knew a lot about subjects that you actually know nothing about. If you convince people that you're a military expert, but actually you don't know diddly squat about it, and you believe that you know how to win wars, but really you don't, then that's dangerous because your ignorance now would get. So if you're ignorant, but you know you're ignorant, then Socrates says, if you're intelligent, but you have areas of ignorance, what you would do is go and study those subjects, or you'd consult an expert, right? Simply. But if you have double ignorance, then you think that you know more than you actually do, and your actions become guided by your ignorance. So you do dangerous things. He said they thought the sophists, like their method, tended to cultivate double ignorance. Like it led to people overestimating their own ability because the whole thing was about creating the appearance that they knew more than they did, like and impressing the audience, for example. So he said, this is toxic. Like, it's going to lead to a whole lot of problems. And it's kind of fundamentally connected to the way that politics works. So Socrates would say another famous saying of Socrates that's kind of more well known in Greece. It gets a little bit forgotten. Is Socrates said that we should be as we wish to appear. So one of the fundamental distinctions that he makes that runs through Greek philosophy is a distinction between appearance and reality, right? Sophistry, or the art of persuasion, is all about appearance. So it's about appearing wise. It's about appearing virtuous. The goal is to convince other people that you're wise. The goal is to convince other people that you understand what's just. The goal is to convince other people that you're courageous, a great military strategist. It doesn't matter whether you actually are or not. And the sophists would boast about that. They would say, you could spend your life studying all these other subjects, but you don't need to, because if you understand the art of persuasion, you only have to study one subject, which is the art of convincing other people that you know things that you don't in fact know.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And he said,
Wow.
in one of Plato's dialogues called The Gorgias, he says one of the scariest things anyone's ever said. Right? He's talking about the sophists, and he portrays one of the sophists in a conversation, talking about the art of persuasion. And he says, look, it's like this. If someone who is trained in the art of persuasion stood before the assembly, like before the Senate, and he gave a speech trying to persuade them what should be the policy, and up against him, you put a physician who was an expert on health, and they were debating matters of public health. He said the sophist, the rhetorician, would win every time, like, even though he knows nothing about the subject, because he's specifically trained in persuading people that he knows about things that he doesn't know.
Yeah.
Evoking their fear, their anger, their greed, and playing on their emotions. He said in a debate between a sophist and an expert physician, the sophist would win every time.
Yeah.
And that's a quite unnerving observation. Like, I think there's some truth in it. But how do we
Still to
apply
this
that
day, right?
today? Right. It's a big problem, right? Today, we're all gullible, like, and we're easily swayed by, people who are good communicators, unfortunately. And sometimes people who are experts in a field aren't great communicators. Maybe they can be rubbish at getting the point across, but they might still know a lot about the subject. Someone might be Socrates says someone could be an expert on something like shipbuilding. They may be rubbish at giving speeches, but they know way more about shipbuilding, than your students do, than the bunch of sophists do, basically. So I guess that brings us back. We were talking about fulfillment and happiness.
Well, those three maxims, just to look at those for a second. So I'm taking it as the first one, know thyself, self-awareness, critical, important. The second one you talk about is temperance or moderation.
Yeah.
Challenge in today's
Nothing
society.
in excess.
Nothing in excess. And the third one, I sort of relate to humility.
Yeah. Socrates is kind of known. He's like the godfather of intellectual humility. He didn't pretend to be an expert on anything. He just thought he had, he'd learned an art of asking questions, basically. So there's a subtext, though. There is a kind of point that Socrates is usually leading towards, even if it's, sometimes it's not clearly stated in the dialogues, because he's asking lots of questions, but you kind of think he seems to be kind of heading towards something, right? Or sometimes he's kind of taking certain things for granted in the conversation. It's more like he's circling around certain ideas, approaching them from different angles. There's a deeper insight there that's kind of hard to articulate, but maybe I can kind of put it into words. I try and be very blunt about.
Well, does Socrates have an agenda? With that questioning, usually people have an agenda as to where they, like you said, where they want to head up.
Yeah.
Whereas he seems like his agenda is just to open the thoughts.
Yeah. People have often said that he has an agenda. He seems to have an idea of where he wants the conversation to go. But he also does seem open to questioning his own assumptions. Right. Yeah. So I think he can have an agenda, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because he also has a kind of intellectual humility and a willingness to be questioned. And in fact, if his agenda is that he exposes what his own assumptions are, that's fine, as long as the next stage is then he's willing for people to critique them. He says in the conversation with Protagoras, there's many weird things. Everything about Socrates is paradoxical, right? You can almost take that for granted. When he's talking to Protagoras, the first sophist, this guy made a fortune by teaching people how to win arguments through the art of persuasion. Socrates says to him, if you're anything like the kind of guy that I am, then you'll take it for granted that it's better to lose an argument than to win one. And Protagoras is like, what the hell? Like, he's standing there in front of a group of his students. And he's like, my entire existence revolves around teaching people to win arguments.
Yeah.
Right? That's what all these guys here paid me a fortune to teach them how to do. And this guy, this clown, like, this weirdo is standing here telling me he thinks it's better to lose arguments. And Socrates says, like, what do you mean? Like, and Socrates explains, well, if you win an argument, you haven't really achieved anything except to kind of impress the audience, right? You create an impression, but that's not really worth that much. And at least in his eyes, right?
Yeah.
He says, but if you lose an argument, the person who loses the argument is the only one that really potentially learns anything. And he says, it's of much more value to me to lose an argument. So I have an agenda. I have certain assumptions. I would be incredibly grateful to you if you could prove to me that they're wrong, because then I would come out of the conversation having gained wisdom.
Yeah.
Like, I've learned something from it. But, if I win the argument, I haven't really learned anything. All I've done is impress some people. I don't really care about that.
Yeah.
Whereas for Protagoras, impressing people was how he made a living. And so it was the be all and end all of it. So Protagoras and Socrates had completely opposing assumptions about the whole nature of debate and what the point of it was and who gained the most from it. Now, I mean, maybe that leads on to, we mentioned happiness. So probably, I know it's a theme that we wanted to talk about. So first thing about happiness is the word is messed up. What have you ever heard someone being described as hapless?
Hapless?
A hapless individual.
He's hapless. No.
No. It's a word that's still sometimes used, although it's a little bit anachronistic. If someone is a hapless individual, then it means that they're wretched and unfortunate.
Right.
And that's because the word hap means luck originally, I believe in Anglo-Saxon. Happiness originally meant being fortunate or lucky. Right. It meant the opposite of being hapless, which means unfortunate or wretched.
Yeah.
We kind of still use it a little bit when we say that maybe we talk about something being a happy accident or like a happy turn of events. What I mean is it was lucky or fortunate.
Fortunate, yep.
So the word happy has become degraded in meaning over the past few centuries. Right now, when people use the word happiness, they mean like a warm glow inside, or it's a feeling.
A feeling.
Right? Yeah. But that's not what it originally meant. Originally, it meant more a state of being in which you were actually flourishing or doing well or fortunate. Now, I can illustrate exactly what the contradiction is that leads to. A heroin addict might be happy, like, because he's high as a kite.
Feeling good.
Heroin. For a while, he feels good, so he's happy. But he's also perhaps a thoroughly hapless individual. He's unfortunate and in a wretched condition.
Yeah.
Right? That's the opposite of what happy originally meant. So it's come to mean something so superficial that it potentially could be used to, we could describe a heroin addict as being happy in the modern superficial sense of the word, that he feels good and he has like a euphoric feeling inside when he's on the drug. But he's deeply unhappy in the original sense of the word, which meant that he's hapless and unfortunate and in a wretched condition. His life is not going well, right? So the word happiness is used to translate the Greek word, a notorious Greek word, eudaimonia, which we actually use in modern psychology as well.
Yeah.
Eudaimonia was perhaps the most important word in ancient philosophy, and it's notoriously difficult to translate into English. So that's quite scary in itself. The Greeks thought the main thing in life is eudaimonia. It's what we should all be striving for. It's one of the most important concepts. We don't even have a word for it anymore, right? That's how alienated we are from it. We've completely forgotten the most important thing in life. We wouldn't even know have a conversation about it, like even if we decided to. It used to be translated as happiness in the original sense of the word.
Yes.
Right. So sometimes this causes confusion when people read classical texts. So Socrates might be talking about happiness. He's not talking about feeling good. Like, he's talking about flourishing, for want of a better word. He's talking about fulfillment in a deeper kind of existential sense, right?
Yeah.
Objectively doing well in life. So Socrates and all Greeks agreed that the goal of life, the supreme goal of life, was eudaimonia, right? That's almost a kind of tautology in Greek, because they all assume that the fundamental goal of life is to do well, like to flourish. But they disagreed about how to define eudaimonia. So some people would say there's a famous dialogue called the Euthydemus Socratic dialogue, where he's talking to some young men, and he says, "Could you define what good fortune is? What eudaimonia is? What flourishing is?" And they say, "Yeah, it's like, when you've got a big house, and when you've got a lot of slaves, and you've got a beautiful wife, and you got you occupy public office. So you've got a nice car, a beautiful wife, big house, loads of money, stuff like that. Wisdom, maybe you've also got courage, you've got certain character traits like that make you a good person." And Socrates says, that's really interesting. He goes, "But hold on a minute. Let me kind of look carefully at this list." He says, let's take money, because that's the easiest example. Suppose you took a big pile of money and you give it to somebody who's wise, temperate, virtuous. They probably use that money to do wise, temperate, virtuous things, right? So I could see why you would think that money is a constituent of good fortune and flourishing. But just one thing, like Columbo, all right? Just one more thing. Is what if you took that big pile of money and you gave it to somebody who was foolish and intemperate? What if you gave it to an evil dictator, or a serial killer, or a torturer, or something like that? Like, wouldn't they just allow them to do more evil and vicious and foolish things? Well, what if you took somebody who was a crackhead and they won the lottery? Like, wouldn't it potentially be the worst thing that ever happened to them? Like, maybe they'd be dead a week later. Like, so Socrates says maybe wealth isn't intrinsically good, but what matters is the use that you make of it. It's just an external advantage. And whether it's good or bad depends on the use that you make of it. And whether you use it well or badly would depend on having a particular type of wisdom. And Euthydemus is like, okay, I kind of get what you're saying. And then Socrates says, spoiler alert, right? Like, or whatever the ancient Greek equivalent is. He says, this applies to everything else on your list, basically.
Yeah.
All of the other things that you named, status, reputation, having a big house, like, they could all be used well or used badly.
Yeah.
Like, you could have a lot of status. You could have like millions of followers on TikTok.
Yeah.
But if you're an evil dictator or an idiot, like, or intemperate, you might use that to do bad things or foolish things. If you're wise and virtuous, maybe you could use it to do wise and virtuous things. It just gives you more ability to influence other people or influence your environment. But that could be good or bad. It's not intrinsically good. It's just an external advantage. And so Euthydemus is like, well, I'm kind of confused now. What are you driving at here, Socrates? And Socrates says, well, maybe there's only really one good thing. And it's inside you, not outside you. And Euthydemus is like, well, what would that be? And Socrates says it's the wisdom to use things well.
Wisdom.
Like, yeah, it's wisdom. It's virtue, as the Greeks call it. By virtue, Greeks mean a type of wisdom. Like, so they think that courage is a type of wisdom, that temperance is a type of wisdom, that justice is a type of wisdom. At least that was Socrates' position and the Stoics' position. Like, they thought maybe involved other qualities, but fundamentally, for these things to be virtuous, they had to be guided by wisdom. And so the goal of life becomes the cultivation of virtue, the cultivation of character, self-improvement in the true sense of the word. like actually improving yourself,
Yeah.
like not just
Yeah.
achieving external things. This is groundbreaking, like, because most people do the opposite. The sophists were just trying to impress people and make as much money as they could. And Socrates said, but you guys have been indoctrinated into pursuing the wrong goal in life. Like, you're looking outside of yourself. You've been brainwashed by egotism, hedonism, consumerism, like, today's celebrity culture and stuff like that. But really, maybe the most important thing in life is to improve your own character, like to become wise, courageous, just, temperate, all that kind of stuff. Maybe that's what eudaimonia consists in. It's not a feeling; it's a state of being.
State of being.
It's a form of wisdom. And so, what can it teach us about happiness? The first thing it would teach us is it would completely turn everything upside down. Like, it would shatter our prevailing cultural values, like, and encourage us to. I say that, I put it in that dramatic language because the Stoics actually use an unusual word to describe this realization. They use the word epistropha, which means is the Greek word for religious conversion. It's kind of a big deal. But in Greek, in Latin, it's conversio. That's where we get the word conversion from. It means turning around, like doing a U-turn, right? So the Stoics believed that when we do philosophy and we question ourselves, what we're aiming to achieve is a kind of radical U-turn in our values, so that instead of running around like in the rat race chasing after a bit of cheese, just one more bit of cheese, like a bit more money, getting things, like maybe that gets shattered. We realize the Cynic philosophers, who were the precursors of the Stoics, called this tuphos. It means like a mist or smoke. Like, they said the prevailing values of our society are smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
So it's all BS. It's all BS because it comes from rhetoric and propaganda and politicians and sophists and influencers that are really, really trying hard to persuade us, like, that we should want the things that they're trying to sell us. Right? So they can control us, basically. And Socrates said philosophy frees us from this cage, frees us from the rat race, and gets us to realize, hey, there's nothing wrong with money. Socrates didn't think money was bad. And the Stoics didn't think money or reputation were bad. They thought they were indifferent in relation to eudaimonia. They're just like tools.
Yes.
So the second most important thing in life to you could be to make money or gain social status, maybe. That would be fine. But it shouldn't be the number one thing. Like, the most important thing in life should be developing the wisdom and strength of character to be able to use wealth and reputation properly and not to be destroyed by pursuit of these things.
So happiness really stems from a greater level of inner wisdom than anything, and should be the primary focus.
The Stoics thought that this becomes obvious, that we don't need philosophy, in a sense. They thought most ordinary people could figure this out for themselves under one particular circumstance. They said there's a particular situation which often, but not always, leads to an aha moment, a eureka moment. The penny drops and people suddenly see through the tuphos, the smoke and mirrors, like the illusion, the prevailing values. What would that be? Well, it's when you come face to face with the prospect of your own death. Like, so when you're lying on your deathbed, and you look back, a lot of people, let's say it's 50-50 or something, right? Not everyone, but a lot of people in that moment look back and think, it started to make me question my values, my priorities in life. I'm starting to think maybe getting 1 million followers on Facebook wasn't actually all that important in retrospect. I'm starting to kind of think, maybe buying a bigger house shouldn't have been like top of my priorities looking back on it. So you start to just question your values a little bit when you're about to gasp your final breath. Now, some people are lucky in that regard, and they have a brush with death early on, and it snaps them out of the trance, right? It wakes them up. Or luckily, the good news is you don't actually have to die yourself, right? It might be that you're bereaved. You're unfortunate enough to lose somebody that's important to you. And it's often when we're bereaved, it makes us imagine coming to terms with our own mortality, kind of vicariously or indirectly, makes us question things. So the Stoics thought the contemplation, Socrates calls it melete thanatou, the contemplation of your own mortality. Socrates says that philosophy is a preparation for death, a training in contemplating the significance, the existential significance of our own mortality. Because coming to terms with that, the one thing that we're most afraid of is actually the thing that would potentially liberate us psychologically from all the brainwashing and propaganda that we're subjected to. It might be the very thing that snaps us out of it and makes us think, all that crap that politicians go on about and celebrities and all the advertising. And so looking back on it, like, when I had the gun to my head and I was about to gasp my final breath, like, it made me think, maybe I shouldn't have listened to all that. Like, perhaps I was just being led a merry dance by all that kind of stuff. And it's not really important in retrospect because you can't take any of it with you. Like, suddenly it becomes worthless, kind of meaningless. And you're left just there's nothing left in your dying hours except your relationship with the universe and the bare existential reality of your own existence or your conscience or whatever. It's only you that's left in that moment. So that's why Stoicism takes this theme from, like, often these things are mentioned by Socrates, and then the Stoics really focus on lean into those aspects of what Socrates said. This kind of like if you read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, some people think he's morbid, but actually in his private letters, which we also have, and in the biographies of him, he's portrayed as somebody who's very good humored and gregarious and very close to his friends. But he goes on and on about death in the Meditations, not because he's preoccupied with it, but because he's systematically training himself. To adopt a philosophical attitude towards his own mortality.
Yes. Very insightful indeed. How would you encourage people to put this in practice in their, like, obviously talking about it, like having conversations, questioning things with someone else or with an audience or whatever it might be? Great. But individually, how could I give myself more time? I mean, I guess, I'm answering my own question really, but meditating on thoughts, writing, journaling. I mean, what are your practices?
Well, there are many, many things that you can do. So in the book, How to Think Like Socrates, I can go into that in more detail and give more examples. The very act of engaging in dialogue. So how would we do that today? Are we just going to sit down and do philosophical dialogues? Probably not. But we can steer the conversation more towards deeper subjects.
Yeah.
Basically, there are ways we can do. Just the most important thing is the desire to do it. Not in a crude or a tactless way, but asking people about their assumptions a bit more, about their values a little bit more. Even with kids, right? Sometimes people ask me, what questions can you ask kids? I think that's kind of easy, right? So I go, here's one question that no one ever asks their kids. But I think it's a good question to ask, right? It takes a little bit of perseverance. At first, they might just look at you like you're crazy. But it's a simple question, right? How would you define wisdom? So what does wisdom mean? Like, even kids have heard of it. You heard of wisdom, right? Like how in the movie, watched this movie the other day, one of the Gandalf's wise, isn't he? Like, what does wisdom mean? Like, how would you define it? Can you think of examples of people that are wise? Examples of people that maybe aren't wise? What's the difference between them, right? Nobody ever asks you to define wisdom. But we've had a whole conversation about how it's possibly the most important thing in life. The ancient Greeks were obsessed with it. They talked about it all the time. Like today, we drink from a veritable fire hose of self-improvement slop, right? When I was a wee boy, I go to the bookshop, there'll be 2 or 3 self-improvement, self-help books.
Yeah.
Right? Now people sit on YouTube all day long, like drinking from this fire hose of supposed self-improvement content.
Yeah.
And I thought, man, I need to get out there more because the people around me out there in the world and society must have been improved immensely. I can't wait to see what these guys look like. Like after all the self-improvement they've been consuming, they must have all been helped by all the self-help and improved by the self-improvement. And then I went out in the world and I explored it and I talked to a few people and I got a big shock. You're not going to believe this, buddy. But it struck me that they didn't seem to have been improved very much, like or helped all that much either. Like as a whole, society collectively seems to me like more neurotic than it was 20 years ago.
We're getting worse.
Yeah, but everybody spends half of their time now, like whether it's Oprah Winfrey or Jordan Peterson or Andrew Tate or whatever else that gets packaged as self-help or self-improvement. I don't see the results of it anywhere. We've had decades of it, like a tidal wave of this stuff. And yet, where's the actual result of any of it? Everyone's more neurotic than they were 20 years ago. It's not working. Like they don't seem all that helped by all the self-help they're consuming. But and despite that, so Seneca said no port is favorable.
No what, sorry?
No wind. He said no wind. No wind is favorable to a ship if you don't know to which port you're sailing. Right. How can you help yourself if you don't know what it is you're trying to help yourself achieve? How can you improve yourself if you don't know what the goal of self-improvement is supposed to be? No wind is favorable to a ship that lacks a port or destination. Like you're just going to go around in circles.
So it's like we're getting told what's wrong with our lives and then getting fed the stuff that we need to do to improve that without actually going in and going, actually, this is what I'm really after and this is what's really missing.
Yeah. The Greek philosophers like Socrates spent a lot more time focusing on helping people to clarify the goal. Like, so they help people to really understand. I said I was going to touch on this earlier. It was a difficult thing to explain. I believe that one of the things that's going on with Socrates is that people find him frustrating because he doesn't give a lecture. He doesn't give a soundbite. Many of the Socratic dialogues appear to end in what the Greeks called apareia. Apareia means confusion, disorientation. It literally means not having a path ahead of you, a road to follow. Like, so he asks a lot of questions. People just end up more confused than they were at the beginning. They feel as if they knew less than they did before the dialogue rather than more. So a lot of people look at that and think, but that's the opposite of what I want. I don't really understand. Like, and so people get frustrated with it. It doesn't give them the
answer.
5 clickbait answers that they're often looking for.
Cure.
So what does it give you? All right, I'll be as direct about this as I can, given that it's something cryptic by its very nature. Socrates implies, and there's some reason in modern psychology to believe this as well, that there's a problem with role-governed behavior. That when we use verbal definitions or rules, we often apply them rigidly in a way that's not very adaptive, right? I'll give you, this is a little bit of a digression, but I'll give you a clear example. There's an experiment where 2 groups of students are asked to solve a puzzle and they get rewarded every time they pull 3 levers in the right order or something like that. And they maybe get punished or penalized if they get it wrong, right?
Yeah.
And one group have to figure out the correct sequence through trial and error. And the other group are given a piece of paper or they're given verbal instructions with a rule to follow, right? So far, so good. And then it's one of those experiments where the conditions change halfway through. right? So one bunch have figured out it's got to be 3-2-1 that they do. The other group have figured out because they've been told, they've been given verbal instructions that 3-2-1 is the sequence that they follow and they get rewarded. But then it changes. So the sequence is 2-3-1, right? And they're not told. So the group that figured it out through trial and error will try their original sequence. They get penalized. They think, what the hell's going on? But they'll gradually figure out they have to try something else, and then they'll figure out the new sequence and they'll get rewarded, right? The group that are given the verbal rule to follow will persist for much longer, even though they're getting penalized, right? So they're rigid and they're not adaptive in their behavior, right? So this is a big problem. Many people have said this seems to be part of what's going on with clients in psychotherapy, that they exhibit. Part of the puzzle is why they persist in maladaptive behavior. And part of the reason they persist it is because they're following verbally defined rules, right? Someone has told them, like Jordan Peterson's got a book called The 12 Rules. When I read that book, it shocked me because for a reason that I think wouldn't occur to most people. It's not a book that any clinical psychologist or CBT practitioner that I've ever heard of recommends to their clients, right? Because it contains a lot of kind of weird advice, to be honest. And it lacks a lot of standard advice, like, like the sort of things that you would expect it to say. But the weirdest thing about it is it starts off by saying that he thinks it's a really good idea to have rigid, verbally defined rules to follow as coping strategies.
Yeah.
And the received wisdom in modern therapy is that that's actually a crap idea, and it usually backfires, right? But people get kind of addicted to it. So people learn coping strategies, like one of them is something like stand up straight and look people in the eye or something like that, right? There's another one about tidy your room and so on.
Yeah.
But what usually happens is that those strategies work in some situations, but not others. So if you stand up straight and look people in the eye, that might project confidence sometimes, and it would work quite well. But if you're a 15-year-old in the playground and you do that to the school bullies, like they might perceive it as a provocation and you get your head kicked in. Right. So whether it's a good strategy or a bad strategy is going to kind of depend on how you do it and when you do it and where you do it. It's overly simplistic and overly rigid, in other words. So this reminds me of the Socratic method. So when Socrates says, how do we define justice? How do we define courage? The original definition that is standing your ground in the face of the enemy isn't necessarily wrong. It would be a valid definition in that context, right? But it's too narrow and too rigid. So at the end of this dialogue, do we have a better definition? Not really, but maybe we have something more intangible and more valuable, which is maybe that we have an implicit understanding of the limits of that definition. Maybe we've got more of a feel for the meaning of the word courage. So I can have an understanding of what courage means that I can't articulate easily in a definition. I might have an understanding because I've engaged in the dialogue that Socrates engages in. I might have an understanding, well, how we define courage might vary a little bit, depending whether it's civilian courage or military courage. Maybe how we define courage for the cavalry would be a little bit different from how we define it. There might be some things that they have in common, but the concept perhaps is complex, and maybe it's a little bit fuzzy around the edges. And maybe I can develop a practical understanding of it, even if it's incomplete, by having a good, deep conversation about it, right? So maybe I do understand the concept more at the end of the dialogue. Like I've been working with the concept, exchanging ideas about it. So maybe I've got a practical understanding of how to apply it, but I don't have a neat dictionary definition of it, right?
Yeah.
Maybe the neat dictionary definition kind of masquerades as understanding, but it's overly simplistic. We know in modern research on emotion and coping with stress, one of the main findings is that there is no emotional coping strategy that consistently works across every situation. And people who exhibit the highest levels of emotional resilience tend to exhibit a trait that researchers call coping flexibility.
Right.
So that means that rather than tidying their room, or standing up straight and looking people in the eye or whatever, rather than practicing mindfulness or practicing assertiveness. They are able to choose selectively between these different strategies depending on the
What is
demands of the
applicable when?
situation. And sometimes they combine them, and sometimes they separate them, and sometimes they modify them.
Yeah.
So these guys have coping flexibility, and they are much more consistently resilient. But people who know how to do mindfulness, and that's their panacea for every situation, it potentially works really well, and then they'll find themselves in a situation where it backfires dramatically.
Yeah.
For example, some people find mindfulness practices work really well for them, but unless they adapt it, they might find that if they become socially anxious and they're giving a wedding speech, trying to cope with that by practicing mindfulness might backfire by increasing their self-consciousness or their self-focused attention, which we know research on social anxiety shows that heightened self-focused attention tends to be one of the main things that fuels social anxiety. And the remedy for social anxiety actually involves focusing your attention more on the audience.
Yes.
That's what you that's more natural. Like when you're speaking to a group of people, and it's unnatural to turn your attention back on yourself as if you're looking in a mirror. It's highly distracting. And so it tends to increase cognitive load and make people make more mistakes, amplifies their feelings of anxiety. So mindfulness could actually be the complete opposite of what you want in that situation. Although maybe there are ways that you could adapt it, right?
Yes.
So the trick is, like, what Socrates is doing in a way is encouraging people. It's like he's saying, I hate to break it to you kids, but you're going to have to learn to think for yourselves.
Yeah.
Basically, he's like, Socrates clearly believes, he explicitly states that just giving people a formula. He was famously mistrustful of books, right? He loved books, but he also thought it would make people lazy and they'd stop thinking for themselves and they would just regurgitate stuff that they'd read in books. And he thought, really it's more important that people learn how to ask the right questions and think things through for themselves. Now, a lot of the things that Socrates said he was worried about, it seems odd now that he had these concerns about books. I think he was right. But they're very similar to the concerns that people have today about AI. Like, people become overly dependent on it. They're going to forget how to actually reason and solve problems for themselves. It's going to make them intellectually lazy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Well, that already happened. Several centuries ago when the printing press was invented. Like, it already happened when people started watching Joe Rogan, and just regurgitating stuff that they heard on a YouTube video, rather than actually trying to figure out their opinions for themselves. We all kind of just became echo chambers, basically reiterating things that opinions that other people had arrived at for us, right? Without really thinking it through for ourselves. But maybe the process of thinking about it for ourselves is what contributes to cognitive and coping flexibility, and is really what Socrates is trying to teach through the Socratic method. And you can't get that, passively. You can't go to a greengrocer and buy it, like you buy a pound of onions or something like that. You can only get it. You get understanding from getting things wrong and learning from your mistakes, and actually practicing thinking.
Not as a rule, Donald, but what in your life daily do you do to give yourself time? I mean, obviously you do a lot of research and writing on these topics, and that probably helps you develop your wisdom.
There are many things. Well, there are many things. I'm lucky, right? Because maybe this is I was going to, just dismiss this as a kind of trivial thing that's good luck. But I mean, maybe it actually is more significant than I was assuming there for a moment. I have worked with many, many individuals over the years. I do a lot of interviews and podcasts. I speak at conferences. I write books. But I do a lot of psychotherapy and coaching. And so by helping other people in coaching or therapy setting, then potentially I learn from other people. Socrates thought the best mirror for the human soul is a dialogue when we engage in meaningful dialogue with other people. So I learn about myself from my coaching clients, right? But I would say you don't need to be a coach or a therapist or whatever. If you go around trying to help people, you approach it in the right way, then potentially by helping other people, you benefit yourself. Right? If you listen to other people and try to really understand them, Like if you empathize with them and try to figure out how they made mistakes that they're making, why they're so depressed, why they're so angry, like you just give them like some time. You know, you don't allow. It'd be easy to get sucked into arguments or try to fix other people's problems, but rather like you're more empathic and you try to understand other people's problems, you know, and you spend you're a little bit more patient with them. Then maybe you'll learn stuff from other people's mistakes, like that
100%.
help you in the way that a coach or a therapist would. There's two practical pieces of advice that I'd leave your audience with, though.
Yeah.
And they're both mentioned in my book, where I can explain them a little bit more clearly. So the first one is, for Stoics, there are many techniques in Stoicism. It's a philosophy that flourished for 500 years, right? It's a big thing. But the central technique of Stoicism is a thing called prosoche. If you go to Greece, you'll still see that word all over the place on signs over, usually it says prosoche skilos, and there'll be a picture of an Alsatian, right? Or something like that. So in modern Greek, it means watch out or beware. Like, it means pay attention. It means mind the dog, right? Prosoche skilos means mind the dog.
Right.
The Stoics use prosoche to mean mindfulness or paying attention to your own thoughts, how you use your experiences, like how you use your impressions, Epictetus said. So the main thing is for Stoics is mindfulness, moment to moment, observing in particular your passions, your desires and emotions, noticing, slowing down enough to begin to notice the initial thoughts, the initial impressions, the initial reactions, and then how you respond to them. Rollo May, people attribute this to Viktor Frankl, but I think it was actually Rollo May that said that the most important thing in life is to introduce a small gap, a small delay between stimulus and response. And that's what human freedom and wisdom consists in. And that's very similar to what the Stoics are saying. Like, slow down, pay attention, and notice how you're responding when you get upset, what your initial impression is. Just long enough to ask yourself, is this the whole story?
Yeah.
Do I have to go along with this?
Yeah.
Or should I maybe question it? Is this how other people would see things? Like, maybe it would be like if you're listening to a sophist or a politician, it's just slowing down and pausing and thinking, this seems really convincing, but is it actually true? Like, just that little sliver of skepticism, like that little suspension, that little delay, like so that you examine your own assumption. Right? Hang on, I'm making this assumption that I'm not going to be able to cope, but is that really true?
Yeah.
Like, is it 100% true? Is it slightly distorted?
Yeah.
Am I jumping to conclusions? So that's the number one thing. Now, I'll give you a more unusual piece of advice.
Yeah, please.
All right. So this is what Socrates literally does. When I read, we have the Socratic dialogues of Plato. Everyone knows about Plato. But what most people don't know is there were 10 followers of Socrates that wrote dialogues. Most of them are lost. There must have been hundreds of Socratic dialogues circulating in the ancient world. And we do have about 40 dialogues from Xenophon, who was an Athenian general, a famous Athenian general, who was a friend of Socrates. And in Xenophon's dialogues, Socrates more obviously does cognitive therapy. His dialogues are more down to earth than Plato's. And in a number of them, he's clearly, explicitly using the Socratic method as a form of cognitive therapy. And there's one of them where he does something that blew my mind when I read it. Because people told me Socrates never wrote any books.
Right.
Well, that's not true. Like, it's not entirely true. Plato says that Socrates wrote poetry when he was in prison, but those poems are lost apart from a few fragments from them. But Epictetus, and this might be crazy talk, but hundreds of years later, Epictetus says something really weird about Socrates. He says Socrates wrote more than anyone else. But he says, but he never published it because he didn't write for other people. He only wrote for himself. Right. So he did something a bit like journaling, according to Epictetus. Right.
Yeah.
Again, it comes back to this thing of be as you wish to appear. Socrates saw writing not as something you do to impress other people, like a sophist, but he saw writing as a tool that you would use to think, like to challenge yourself. And what did he write? Well, who knows? Except we have a weird clue. In one of Xenophon's dialogues, Socrates draws a diagram. He's talking to a young guy, and this young guy asks him to explain the Socratic method, and he does it by drawing a diagram. And the reason it blew my mind is I thought, no one's ever told me about this. I've never seen this. And not only was it odd that he was doing it at all, but the diagram he draws was virtually identical. It was immediately recognizable to me because it's virtually identical to a diagram that someone is drawing right now in a consulting room with a CBT client, like all over the world. It's one of the most common things that we do in cognitive therapy on a flip chart. So we get a flip chart and we draw two columns. It's called the two-column technique. Socrates sits with a wax tablet, I assume. We're not told. He draws two columns with this guy. And he says, the young man he's talking to has been training with the sophists. He says, what is it you want to do? And he says, I want to be a great politician, like Pericles, a great statesman. Socrates says that means that you must know what's best for society. The Greeks called that dikaiosune, or justice.
Yeah.
He says, I'm an expert on it. I've been learning all about it. And Socrates says, okay, so at the top of one of these columns, I'm going to write the word justice. He writes the initial letter, actually. And at the top of the other column, I'm going to write injustice. And I want you just to give me some examples. He said, well, it's easier to give examples of injustice, like, because there's a lot of idiots around, right? And Socrates says, okay, like, go ahead then. We'll start with injustice. It's often the case that people find it easier to give examples of vices rather than virtues. Right? So, because people are cynical. So this guy says, well, Socrates asks him, gives him some examples. He said, what about this? What about that? And together they write down, maybe stealing would be an example of injustice. Lying, another classic example of injustice, right? So Socrates says, wow, you've learned a lot from these sophists. So stealing and lying are examples of injustice. That's the kind of knowledge that would allow someone to become a great statesman like Pericles, I guess. Like you've given me this list of definitions. Just one more thing, though, he says. Do you think there's any circumstances under which, let's say, lying could potentially be moved from the column marked justice, for injustice, into the one marked justice? Like, could there ever be a context, a time, a place, a situation where lying might be classified as just? Like, so it's the fuzzy edge, like the deeper understanding of the concept that you don't get from the soundbite dictionary definition, right? He's pushing this guy like to question his own assumptions. And the young guy's called Euthydemus. He's like, well, I don't really know. And Socrates says, well, what about if you're an elected Athenian general? The Athenians elected their generals. And he said, what would happen if you lied to the enemy and during a siege or something? Would that be considered unjust? And Euthydemus says, well, in warfare, it's a bit different, and deceiving the enemy is like something that is normally considered acceptable. Like, so that's different, Socrates, right? Socrates says, I see. What happens if you're a parent and you've got a small child and they're sick, but they won't take the medicine unless you conceal it in their food? Isn't that a form of deception, or lying, as you call it? He said, yeah. Would that be unjust? He said, well, no one would really call that unjust. That's different, Socrates, right? Socrates says, I see. And then he asked him about a famous example that recurs throughout the history of philosophy. He said, what if your friend was suicidal and he asked you where you'd hidden his sword or his dagger, and you lied to him because you wanted to protect him from himself? Would that be considered unjust? And Euthydemus says, well, that's different, Socrates, right? But he uses this two-column technique, to force him to explore the fuzzy edges of his definition and develop not just a simple verbal definition of what justice is, or what wisdom is, or what flourishing is, or what happiness is, but a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the concept. Like, so sometimes lying, usually lying is considered unjust, but in some contexts, it might actually be considered just. And the same goes for stealing. Socrates says, what if an elected Athenian general seized the weapons of the enemy from their camp during war? And Euthydemus says, well, yeah, that wouldn't be considered unjust. That's stealing, but that would be considered just. It's a different context.
Yeah. Well explained. Love it. Loved it all. Donald, what are you working on? A book about anger now?
I'm writing a book about anger. It's my favorite subject. I used to like anxiety, but now I'm more into anger. It's a big deal. Like, I mean, if you want to know about anger, you just need to go on YouTube, like this, and look at the comments section, like the manosphere, which is this big self-improvement thing. I thought it was strange earlier, when I said about people being helped. I thought when people watch Andrew Tate videos, who claims to be doing self-improvement, and also Jordan Peterson, I thought, are the audience becoming less angry the more of these guys' videos they consume? And so I went and I looked, and I thought, it kind of strikes me that they seem to be getting angrier, like as a result, rather than less angry, paradoxically. So that interested me. It struck me that a lot of modern self-improvement actually seems to be fueling anger. And I think the reasons why it does are obvious, because it often combines political rhetoric. And political rhetoric thrives on anger, like we said earlier. It's often all about blaming other people, whether it's women or feminists or cultural Marxists or whatever. Like, the more you get into blaming other people, the more potential, at the very least, you need to balance that with taking ownership for your own emotions. Like, if you don't, and all you do is blame other people, that, my friend, is what I like to describe as a recipe for neurosis. Like, so that's what it seemed to me that these guys were purveying. And I looked in the comment sections of their videos, and sure as anything, I thought, I can't believe it. I would think all these angry young guys that are watching one Jordan Peterson video after another, and an Andrew Tate video and stuff like that, all these guys, like, they must be becoming less angry, but they weren't. They were becoming more angry, it seemed to me.
So this is your next piece of work.
Yeah, I thought we need to look at what Socrates and the Stoics say about anger. We have an entire book by Seneca called On Anger. That's about anger. And there's a mountain of modern research on anger that no one ever tells you about. Like, we know loads of things. It's a complicated thing. Like, we know lots and lots of things about anger that no one ever tells anyone about. So, like, why would that be? It makes us more gullible and more easily manipulated. If you want to manipulate people, the easiest way to do it is to make them angry. So no one's going to tell us, how does anger actually work? Like, what does it do? How does it function? Shh. Don't let them figure that out, But there's centuries, like 2,000 years worth of philosophy, mountains of modern psychological research that could help people to develop a much more profound understanding. And knowledge is power. If you know what anger is, you know what anxiety, you know what depression is. Once you know what these emotions are, like, it puts you back in the driving seat. You gain more control over your own life.
So when can we expect this next book?
Well, it won't be out for quite a long time. Right? Because traditional publishing takes about a year and a half.
Okay.
So it takes a lot of research. The books I write are interdisciplinary. So I have to know a lot about psychological research, about ancient history. There's bits of Greek and Latin, philosophy. But that means those books are very difficult for AI to replicate. Right? So AI can write books now in 30 seconds. Right? But it can't write a book like this. It struggles with this kind of crossover. So the book is about anger, but it's also the story of the fall of the Roman Republic. And the first chapter is about the assassination of Julius Caesar.
Right.
Because I think it provides one of the most useful examples of anger. The guy, the lead assassin, Brutus, was a philosopher. But I think he was guided by anger when he killed Julius Caesar. Because the moment he killed Julius Caesar, the other assassins, he was stabbed 23 times. The moment they did it, it became apparent that they had no idea what they were going to do next. They lacked foresight, which is characteristic of anger. Like, people who are angry often feel compelled to take extreme action and then regret it afterwards because they haven't thought through the consequences of what they're doing. And then what happened was a cycle of civil war that went on for nearly 14 years and led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. So it was a bloodbath that ensued, essentially. It was catastrophically ill thought through. And so it's actually shaped history dramatically. Arguably, the fact that this guy was guided by anger and that clouded his judgment, like, reshaped the... And it might be relevant. I mean, I didn't know this when I started writing this book. I didn't expect to turn on the news and the American president was start going on about how he thought it was a great idea to decapitate regimes. You know, I thought, that sounds familiar. Like, that's exactly what the conspirators thought when they assassinated Julius Caesar. Like, but I thought, surely Donald Trump and the advisors around him couldn't be like Brutus and the conspirators around him and be looking for crude solutions to complex problems. They must have a plan about what the consequences of killing the Ayatollah would be. Like, Brutus had no idea what he would do next, but I'm sure Donald Trump has thought about this, and he's got some kind of sophisticated plan of action about how to secure peace and stability in the region. I'd like to think, but maybe I'm wrong.
Could be wrong.
We'll see. Time will tell.
Donald, been a lovely chat. Let's get you back on for your next book.
Yeah, once this book's finished, if we're still here, I'll come back on in a year and a half. It's an eternity away. Like, we'll probably our AI overlords will have taken over by that point. But like, I'll still be promoting my book.
We'll see. It's been a pleasure, absolutely, and thank you for sharing so much.
You're welcome. Cheers.
Guys, all the links in the show notes at thehiddenwhy.com for Donald. Reach out, get his books, have a read, follow, and we'll see you next time. Peace, passion, and purpose. See you soon. Okay, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for tuning in this week to this interview. I hope you enjoyed the conversation we had. Make sure you check it out at thehiddenwhy.com for the show notes and links to our guest. And if you have any comments, any suggestions for the show, please make sure you reach out as well. Also, would like to just ask a favor. If you do like what you're listening to, if you love what you're hearing, make sure you subscribe. Whether you're listening to this on iTunes, wherever it might be, subscribe to the podcast so you can stay up to date with all the latest episodes. And some exciting changes happening this year at The Hidden Why, including the launch of our new website, which will be updated very soon. So watch this space for that, guys. And once again, live more fully, have more meaning, find more joy. We'll see you around the next interview.